You almost certainly know the story now because it is everywhere. Mehdiosa was a beautiful young woman, a priestess in the temple of the goddess Athena. And the sea god Poseidon saw her and wanted her and raped her inside Athena's own temple on sacred ground. And Athena, instead of punishing the god who had done it, turned her fury on the woman it was done to. She cursed Mehdiosa. She turned her beautiful hair into a nest of snakes and her gaze into a weapon that would turn any man who looked at her to stone, and cast her out to live alone at the edge of the world, a monster, until a hero came and cut off her head. The victim, punished twice, once by the god, once by the goddess for a crime committed against her. It is a devastating story. It has become one of the most retold myths of the last decade, a symbol of exactly the kind of injustice we are most alert to now. The woman blamed for her own assault, the powerful man who walks away, the authority that turns on the victim instead of the perpetrator. It feels ancient, and it feels true, and it is told everywhere as the real Greek myth of Mehdiosa. And it is not Greek. That entire version, the beautiful priestess, the rape in the temple, Athena punishing the victim, comes from a Roman poet writing 800 years after the Greeks first told the story of Mehdiosa. In the actual Greek sources, the old ones, there is no beautiful woman, no assault, no transformation, no punishment. Mehdiosa was simply born a monster. And what the Greeks actually did with her is stranger, and in some ways deeper, than either the villain we inherited or the victim we invented. Because to them, the monster and the protector were the same face. Let us be fair to the version everyone knows because it is genuinely powerful and it is doing real work for people. In this telling, the priestess, the temple, the curse, Mehdiosa is a tragedy of misplaced blame. She does nothing wrong. Poseidon commits the crime. And Athena, who ought to defend a woman violated in her own sanctuary, instead disfigures her, as though the desecration were Mehdiosa's fault for being desirable. It is a story about how societies punish victims, and it lands hard. And there is a reason it has spread across the internet and the culture in the last 10 years until it feels like the definitive account. Some versions push it one step further and say Athena's curse was secretly a gift, that by making Mehdiosa unlookable, deadly to any man who approached, Athena was protecting her, giving her a power that meant no one could ever hurt her again. A dark kindness disguised as a punishment. Here is the problem with both of those. Neither of them is old, and the protective version is not ancient at all. The idea that Athena was secretly protecting Mehdiosa appears in no Greek or Roman source whatsoever. It is a modern reading, 21st century, grafted onto the myth because we want it to be there. And the rape and punishment story itself, the priestess in the temple, is not Greek either. It comes entirely from one specific place. The Roman poet Ovid, writing his Metamorphoses around the year 8 of the Common Era, more than 7 centuries after Homer and Hesiod. To find out who Mehdiosa actually was to the Greeks who invented her, you have to go back behind Ovid to the oldest sources. And when you do, the beautiful victim simply is not there. Go to Hesiod, one of the 2 oldest voices in Greek myth, writing around the same time as Homer. Hesiod gives us Mehdiosa's origins, and there is no priestess and no temple. Mehdiosa is one of three sisters, the Gorgons, daughters of ancient sea deities and primordial monsters born from the deep, not women transformed. She is a Gorgon from birth. Her two sisters are immortal. She alone is mortal, which is the only reason she can be killed at all. There is no before. There is no beautiful girl she used to be. In the oldest Greek telling, Mehdiosa did not become a monster. She was always one. And Hohmer, the other founding voice, does not tell a story about Mehdiosa at all. He uses her. In the Iliad, the face of the Gorgon, the Gorgo, appears as a thing of pure terror emblazoned on shields and on the Aegis, the storm shield of Athena and Zeus. It is an image designed to freeze an enemy with fear. Hohmer does not need Mehdiosa to have a tragic backstory. He needs her face to be the most frightening thing that can be painted on a piece of armor. To the earliest Greeks, that is what she was. Not a character with a history, but a face, glaring eyes, tusks, a lolling tongue, snakes, the concentrated image of horror itself. So the Greek Mehdiosa and the Roman Mehdiosa are almost two different beings. The Greek one is a born monster, faceless in the sense of having no inner life, a weaponized horror. The Roman one, Ovid, is a person, a wronged woman with a past, a beauty, a violation, a grief. Ovid took a Greek monster and gave her an inside, the same way later poets gave the lovesick Cyclops an inside, the same way they kept softening these figures into people. And in Mehdiosa's case, that later, humanized Roman version is the one that survived into our world and became, for most people, the whole truth. We are telling a Roman story and calling it Greek. But here is where it gets genuinely strange, and where the Greeks turn out to be doing something neither the villain version nor the victim version prepares you for. Because they did not just fear Mehdiosa, they wore her. When Perseus finally beheads Mehdiosa, approaching her by looking only at her reflection in a polished bronze shield, so her petrifying gaze cannot reach him, the first thing that happens is not death but birth. Out of the blood of her severed neck spring two beings, a golden-armored giant and Pegasus, the winged horse, one of the most beautiful creatures in all of Greek myth. The monster's death does not just end something, it releases something. From the ruin of the most horrifying face imaginable comes a horse with wings. Even at the moment of her killing, Mehdiosa is generative. The terrible thing gives rise to the wondrous one. And that is before her head does anything at all. Because her severed head does not stop being powerful, it becomes the single most powerful object in the mythology. Perseus uses it as a weapon, turning enemies and monsters to stone. And then he gives it to Athena, and Athena fixes the face of Mehdiosa onto her shield, her Aegis, and wears it into every battle. The head of the monster becomes the emblem of the goddess, and it does not stop with Athena. The face of Mehdiosa, the Gorgon, the Greeks called it, gets put everywhere. On the shields of ordinary soldiers, over the doors of houses and temples, on coins, on ovens, on children's cradles, stamped onto amulets. And the reason is the thing that flips the whole story. They used her face to protect. The Gorgon was an apotropaic image, a thing that wards off evil. The idea was that a face so terrible it could turn you to stone would frighten away demons, curses, bad luck, harm. So the most fearsome monster in Greek myth became, in death, a guardian, A face you put on your home and your armor and your baby's cradle precisely because it was frightening, so that it would frighten worse things away. Sit with the shape of that. The monster is not defeated and discarded. The monster is decapitated and then installed as a protector, hung over the doorway to keep the family safe, worn on the breast of the goddess to keep her unconquered. The Greeks looked at the most horrifying face they could imagine and decided it was exactly what they wanted standing guard. Mehdiosa dead is more use than Mehdiosa alive, not as a trophy, but as a shield. And there is one detail in the Greek that ties the whole paradox into a single knot, and it is her name. Mehdiosa is not a monster word. It comes from a Greek verb meaning to rule, to guard, to protect. Her name means roughly the guardian, the protectress, the one who watches over. The most terrifying figure in the mythology is named at the root for protection, and everything the Greeks actually did with her bears that name out. Her face guards the doorway. Her head guards the goddess. She is, from the beginning, in the very letters of her name, a protector wearing the mask of a monster. Which means the two versions we argue about today, is she a villain, is she a victim, are both, in a way, missing what the Greeks saw. They did not experience Mehdiosa primarily as a wicked monster to be slain, and they had never heard of her as an innocent woman to be pitied. They experienced her as something harder to hold, a horror that keeps you safe. A face too dreadful to look at, put to work guarding what you love. The apotropaic logic is deeply strange to us. We do not, mostly, ward off evil by displaying something more evil, but it is one of the oldest instincts there is, and Mehdiosa is its purest expression. You do not defeat the terrible thing. You point it outward and let it terrify your enemies instead of you. The Roman victim story is beautiful and it matters, and there is no reason to stop telling it. It says something true about how blame gets misassigned, and it has given a lot of people a myth they need. But it is Ovid's, not the Greeks. And when it became the only story, it quietly buried the older, weirder thing, that the Greeks took the most frightening face they could conceive of and made it a blessing. Not a woman punished, not a monster killed. A guardian, exactly as her name says, standing at the threshold with a face like a scream, keeping the dark away. So was Mehdiosa a victim? In the Greek sources, the ones that made her, there is no victim to find because there is no crime and no transformation, only a monster born a monster, and a face so terrible it became a shield. The wronged priestess is a Roman addition, Ovid's 8 centuries later, and the secretly protective Athena is a modern one, ours, later still. Every generation has reached into this myth and left its own concerns behind. The Greeks left an amulet, the Romans left a tragedy of misplaced blame, and we have left a story about a system that punishes the innocent. None of them is simply wrong. But if you want the oldest Mehdiosa, the real one under all the layers, she is not a woman at all. She is a guardian in the shape of a nightmare. And maybe that is the most honest thing to say about her. And about all of these figures we have spent these episodes digging under. The Greeks did not build clean heroes and clean monsters. They built faces we could pour meaning into for 3,000 years and pay any Elope who might not have waited, the Cyclops who sang love songs, the Sirens who offered knowledge, the witch who saves the hero with no magic heel, and the monster whose severed head we hang over the door to keep us safe. Every one of them turned out to be more than the single image we froze them into. That is why they are still here. A flat story ends. A contradiction lives forever, because every age can climb inside it and find itself looking back. Medusa is looking back right now. From a coin, from a shield, from a doorway, from the front of a fashion house that took her face as a logo without ever knowing that in Greek her name means the one who protects. She was never only the monster. She was never only the victim. She was, from the first, the guardian at the gate, and she has been standing there, keeping watch the whole time. But whose face comes next, and what we have made of it, is a tale for another night.